Imagine the most powerful person in the world, commander-in-chief, leader of the free world, the person with their finger on the nuclear button. Now imagine that person so drunk they can barely stand up, slurring their words, making decisions that could change the course of history while completely wasted. You'd think that's impossible, right? That there's no way we'd ever let someone like that run the country? Well, I've got news for you. It's happened, multiple times, and some of the stories are so wild, so unbelievable, that if you saw them in a movie, you'd say they were too ridiculous to be true. Today, we're diving into the dark, messy, and honestly shocking world of presidential drinking. We're talking about the presidents who weren't just having a casual beer or a glass of wine with dinner. We're talking about full-blown alcoholics who ran the United States while battling demons that would have destroyed most people. And the craziest part, most of this got covered up, hidden, or just straight up ignored. Buckle up. This is going to be a rough ride. Let's start with the most famous one, the president whose drinking has been debated, analyzed, and argued about for over 150 years, Ulysses S. Grant. Now here's the thing about Grant. Was he actually a drunk? Or was that just vicious propaganda spread by his enemies? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and that's what makes his story so complicated. Grant was a war hero, the man who won the Civil War for the Union. He was brilliant on the battlefield, brave, strategic, a genuine military genius. But when he wasn't at war, when he was just regular Ulysses trying to live a normal life, the guy struggled hard. Before the Civil War, Grant was essentially a failure. He tried being a farmer, failed. Tried selling firewood, failed. He worked in his father's leather shop and hated every second of it. He was depressed, broke, separated from his wife for long periods, and during those dark times, he drank. A lot. There are documented accounts of Grant getting so drunk he'd pass out, of him being removed from military posts before the Civil War because of his drinking. His reputation was so bad that when the Civil War started and he rejoined the army, people were skeptical. They thought he was just a washed-up drunk. But then something changed. When Grant had purpose, when he had a mission, when he was leading troops and fighting battles, he barely drank at all. It was like the war gave him a reason to stay sober. His wife Julia also helped keep him on track when she was around. However, when he became president in 1869, the pressure was different. The battlefield was clear. You have an enemy, you defeat them, you win. Politics? That's messy. That's backstabbing and corruption and constant criticism. And Grant struggled with it. Did he drink heavily as president? Some historians say yes, occasionally. Others say his enemies exaggerated or made up stories to damage his reputation. What we know for sure is that his presidency was plagued by scandals. Not because of his drinking, but because he trusted the wrong people. He surrounded himself with corrupt advisors who took advantage of his trusting nature. But Grant's drinking, whether exaggerated or real, followed him his entire life. Even on his deathbed, dying of throat cancer, people whispered that it was because of his drinking and smoking. The man saved the Union, and his legacy is forever tied to a whiskey bottle. Fair or not, that's history. Now let's talk about a president whose drinking wasn't debated. Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, and hands down one of the saddest stories in presidential history. Pierce didn't start out as an alcoholic. He was a successful lawyer, a congressman, a senator. Handsome guy, charming, had everything going for him. He married a woman named Jane, and by all accounts, he loved her deeply. But tragedy followed Franklin Pierce like a shadow. First, he and Jane had 3 sons, 3 boys, and all 3 of them died in childhood. Can you even imagine that? Losing one child is devastating. But 3? That kind of pain breaks people. The worst one was their last son, Benny. He was 11 years old, and 2 months before Pierce's inauguration as president, they were all on a train together when it derailed. Franklin and Jane survived. Benny didn't. He died right in front of them. His head was crushed. 2 months later, Franklin Pierce had to stand up and become President of the United States. His wife was so destroyed by grief that she barely functioned as First Lady. She spent most of her time in the White House writing letters to their dead son. And Franklin? He drowned his grief in alcohol. He was drunk constantly during his presidency. His administration accomplished almost nothing. He's consistently ranked as one of the worst presidents in American history, not because he was evil or corrupt, but because he was so destroyed by personal tragedy that he couldn't function. After his presidency, it got worse. He drank even more heavily. His wife died a few years later, which sent him into an even deeper spiral. He died of cirrhosis of the liver in 1869. The man literally drank himself to death. And here's the heartbreaking part. People at his funeral said he looked relieved, like death was finally a release from the pain he'd been carrying for years. That's not a funny drunk story, that's a tragedy. That's what alcoholism really looks like when it's combined with unbearable grief. But if you want a story that's more shocking than sad, let me tell you about Andrew Johnson's inauguration. Andrew Johnson became vice president in 1865 under Abraham Lincoln. And on Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1865, he had to give a speech. Standard procedure. The vice president gives a speech, the president gives a speech, everyone celebrates, and then they get to work. Except Andrew Johnson showed up drunk, not tipsy, not had a few too many. Full-on, stumbling, slurring drunk. See, Johnson had been sick with typhoid fever. And on the morning of the inauguration, he told Lincoln's outgoing vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, that he needed a drink to steady his nerves and give him strength because he was still recovering. Hamlin, being a nice guy, gave him some whiskey. Johnson drank it. Then he had another. And another. By the time he was supposed to give his speech, the man was wasted. Witnesses said he rambled, he slurred. He made no sense. He went on and on about how he was a man of the people, how he came from nothing, how he wasn't some fancy aristocrat. He basically gave a drunk rant instead of a vice presidential inaugural address. Lincoln was mortified. He leaned over to the military officer next to him and whispered, "Do not let Johnson speak outside." Because they were supposed to go out on the steps of the Capitol after the indoor ceremony and speak to the crowd. Lincoln knew that Johnson was too drunk and needed to be kept away from the public. Poor Abraham Lincoln. 6 weeks later, he'd be assassinated, and this drunk guy would become President of the United States. To be fair to Johnson, he claimed he wasn't normally a heavy drinker and that the whiskey hit him hard because he was still weak from typhoid. And for the most part, he didn't have a reputation as a drunk during his presidency. But that inauguration, that was a disaster. And people never forgot it. Now let's jump forward to the 20th century. Richard Nixon. Oh boy. Nixon's drinking during his final days in the White House is the stuff of legend, and unlike some of the earlier presidents, we have detailed documentation of this because people around him wrote about it extensively. During the Watergate scandal, as the walls were closing in, as it became clear he was going to be impeached and probably removed from office, Nixon started drinking heavily. We're talking late nights, alone in the White House, multiple drinks, spiraling into depression and paranoia. His chief of staff, Alexander Haig, and Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger were so worried about Nixon's mental state that Schlesinger reportedly told military commanders that if Nixon gave any unusual orders, especially anything involving nuclear weapons, they should check with him or Kissinger first before following through. Think about that. The Secretary of Defense was so concerned that the president might drunkenly start a nuclear war that he told the military to ignore potential orders from the commander-in-chief. There are accounts of Nixon wandering the White House halls late at night, drunk, talking to the paintings of former presidents, asking them for advice, having full conversations with portraits. Henry Kissinger described finding Nixon in the Lincoln bedroom, on his knees, drunk, crying, asking Kissinger to pray with him. This wasn't just a guy having a few drinks to cope with stress. This was a breakdown, a complete psychological collapse fueled by alcohol. And yet, he was still president, still technically in charge of the most powerful country on earth, still had access to the nuclear codes. It's terrifying when you really think about it. Nixon resigned in August 1974 before he could be impeached. and after he left office, he apparently got his drinking under control. But those final weeks in the White House? That was as dark as presidential drinking has ever gotten in modern times. Let's talk about another one. James Buchanan, the 15th president, serving right before Lincoln. Buchanan was a lifelong bachelor, the only president to never marry, and he was known around Washington as a heavy drinker even before he became president. His capacity for alcohol was legendary. There's a story that at a dinner party, Buchanan drank an entire bottle of wine by himself and then switched to whiskey, all while remaining functional and coherent. The man had a tolerance that was honestly superhuman. His nickname in some circles was 10-Cent Jimmy because he believed that 10 cents was a fair price for a barrel of whiskey, not a glass, not a bottle, a barrel. As president, Buchanan is generally considered one of the worst in history because he basically did nothing as the country slid toward civil war. He watched southern states prepare to secede and just let it happen. He was passive, ineffective, paralyzed by indecision. Was that because of drinking? Hard to say definitively, but it probably didn't help that the man governing during one of the most critical moments in American history was reportedly going through a bottle of wine with every dinner. Here's the broader question, though. Why did so many presidents drink, and why did we let them? Part of it is cultural. Drinking was just more accepted in earlier American history. It wasn't seen as the health crisis or addiction issue we understand it to be today. People drank water from questionable sources, so beer and wine were often safer. Social drinking was normal. Heavy drinking was common. Part of it is the pressure of the job. Being president is incredibly stressful. You're responsible for millions of lives. Every decision you make has massive consequences. People criticize you constantly. Half the country hates you no matter what you do. That kind of pressure breaks people, and for some, alcohol is how they cope, and part of it is that we just didn't have the support systems, the understanding of mental health, or the addiction treatment that we have today. If you were depressed, if you had trauma, if you were struggling, there was no therapy, no medication, no interventions. You just dealt with it. And for many people, dealing with it meant drinking. But here's what really gets me. These were human beings. Flawed, broken, struggling human beings who happened to have the most important job in the world. And instead of getting help, instead of having systems in place to support them, they suffered in silence. Or in Pierce's case, in very public, tragic decline. We like to think of presidents as larger than life, as heroes, as perfect leaders. But they're not. They're people, and people have demons. Grant struggled with purposelessness and depression. Pierce was destroyed by grief. Johnson made a terrible mistake on the worst possible day. Nixon crumbled under pressure and paranoia. Buchanan was probably self-medicating loneliness and the weight of impossible decisions. These stories aren't just about drinking. They're about pain, about the human cost of power, about what happens when we put people in positions of incredible stress without giving them the tools to handle it. And honestly, it makes you wonder about current and future presidents. Are they okay? Do they have support? Are we setting them up to succeed or to break like the men we've talked about today? The presidency has destroyed a lot of people. Some of them just happen to have alcohol involved in their destruction. So what do we take away from all this? Maybe it's compassion. Maybe it's understanding that leadership doesn't make you immune to human weakness. Maybe it's recognition that we need to do better in supporting people in positions of power, not just for their sake, but for all of us. Because when the president is struggling, when they're making decisions while impaired or broken or drowning in grief, we all suffer the consequences. If this deep dive into the darker side of presidential history shocked you, like it shocked me, hit that subscribe button. We tell the stories they don't teach in school, the real, messy, human stories behind the myths. Smash the like button if you learned something new today, and drop a comment telling me what other presidential secrets you want us to uncover. Should we do presidential scandals next? Health problems? Failed marriages? Let me know. Share this with anyone who thinks they know everything about American presidents, because I guarantee this side of history will surprise them. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.